Good evening, folks. I would like to sort of just clear things up. I'm not an expert before anybody asks. I'm just somebody who's been very, very interested in the Kennedy family for about 30 or 40 years. And I want to talk tonight about four particular incidents of the blood feud. But before I do, I want to give you a little bit of background information for some of you who might not know a lot about the family. The Kingdom of Carrick has for centuries traditionally been the heartland home of one of Scotland's greatest historical families, the Kennedies. Although some accounts differ, there's a general consensus that although the Kennedies were present in Carrick from early times, their power was actually advanced when and after they took possession of the newer castle. There are differing accounts as to how this happened, with some accounts saying that they were given the castle by the Crown for their support of the king against the Vikings at the Battle of Largs. Other accounts say that, in fact, there were a Viking unit holding the castle at the time and that the Kennedies drove them out. So we'll have to just wonder exactly what happened. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that around 1357, King David of Scotland II confirmed a certain John Kennedy in all the lands of South Ayrshire, and from that day the name of Kennedy became synonymous with Carrick. The Kennedys prospered and they branched out all over the family areas and with different units and Lairdships within Carrick and in fact beyond down into Galloway. They became more and more powerful, with many of their number actually reaching very high office at home and abroad. For some examples, James Kennedy of the Newer married Princess Mary, the second daughter of King Robert III of Scotland, and their second son, Gilbert, became First Lord Kennedy, and their third son, James, became Bishop of St Andrews, and in fact founded a collegiate college there. Sir Hugh Kennedy of Ardstinshire at Ballantrae played a leading role fighting for Joan of Arc at the relief of the Siege of Orleans in 1429. And in 1562, the last abbot of Crossraguel, Abbot Quintin Kennedy, debated matters of religion with John Knox in a house in Maybole. And the house is gone now, but there's still a street in Maybole called John Knox Street. Lady Jane Kennedy, daughter of Gilbert, the fourth Earl of Carrick, who was known as Yin Greedy Man, tied a handkerchief of Carrick lace around the eyes of Mary Queen of Scots at Fotheringay Castle on the morning of her execution. Queen Mary gifted Lady Jane her silver crucifix and chain, and at the back of the crucifix there is a small compartment at one time held a lock of her son James VI's hair. It's still in the possession of the Kennedy family to this day. Lady Jane's father that I've mentioned, Gilbert, the fourth Earl, Yin Greedy Man as he was known at the time, he was a fascinating character. He had fought for Mary Queen of Scots at the Battle of Langside in 1568, which she lost, and then had to fly to England. Such was his self-esteem, and you might not believe this, he afterwards advised everybody that he had fought for Mary not as a subject, but as an ally, as King of Carrick in Scotland. Thereafter, right up to the current time, the late 7th Marquess of Aylesbury still took great pride in the self-styled title of King of Carrick, and his late son, Charles the 8th Marquess, and a close friend of mine, held a similar belief. The Kennedys were, in a sense, in law unto themselves, and their history is a fascinating one, and it's sometimes a very bloody one. Not only did they fight with surrounding families out with Carrick and beyond, but even among themselves. The crime of hame-sucking, I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It's still in the statute books today, but it was known as home-sacking. And what would happen on a weekend or any night, they would raid a neighbour's land, stealing stock. It was a regular occurrence, apparently, in Carrick, and I still believe, in fact, some would say that nothing's changed in Carrick on a Saturday night today. So a fascinating family. The Kennedys often disagreed on national politics. For example, Sir John Kennedy, 6th Earl of Castles, was a prominent Covenanter who signed the Solemn League and Covenant in 1638, and while in 1655, his relative Archibald Kennedy of Culzean fought the government against the Covenant for the king, and he took great pleasure, and it's accounted, in actually killing one himself. He shot a man through the back of the head while he was chasing him. The guy was trying to escape. So they followed both sides. And he did. It was this guy was Gilbert McAdam, and apparently the Kennedy Lord took great pleasure in shooting him. Now, it became known eventually as Archibald the Wicked of Culzean, and it's said that when he died, a fiery chariot was seen coming over the sky at Culzean, and the devil in it, and he was shouting, "I've come to Culzean for the body and soul of Archibald the Wicked." So they're very, very famous. However, in the 16th century, a great and very bloody feud broke out between the two great Kennedy families in Carrick, the main families. We have the House of Cassills on the side of the River Doon, on the banks of the River Doon, and the House of Bargany on the banks of the River Girvan. The dispute appears to have had several causes, but mainly on two particular matters. Firstly, over which of the houses, either Cassills or Bargany, was in fact the most famous and was the base of the family. In other words, the senior line of the family. And secondly, because Kennedy of Bargany supported the Reformation, while Gilbert IV, Earl of Castle, supported the Catholic cause. They fought on opposite sides at the Battle of Langside with Mary Queen of Scots. And it caused great annoyance on both sides. As this blood feud progressed through more than 3 or 4 generations, characters became involved. And it invariably involved other lairds in Carrick and Galloway who were forced into supporting one side or the other. There's an old rhyme which says, "'Twixt Wigton and the Toon o' Ayr, Portpatrick and the crews o' Cree, nae man need to think by to bide there, unless he court with Kennedy." In other words, if you weren't with the Kennedy, you were against them, and you might not survive very long. Anyway, in every historical conflict, Machiavellian characters appear, and the Kennedy feud was no exception. On the Castle side, Thomas Kennedy of Culzean, who was known as the tutor of Cassills because he taught the young lord, was the mastermind behind much of the plotting, while on the Bargany side, the role was taken up by John Muir of Auchendrane, who, due his night marauding and murderous actions, the things he did when he wore a long grey riding cloak, became known as the Grey Man of Carrick. However, both of them, in a moment, we'll hear more, will tell about the foul and bloody deeds they carried out. But let's first of all look at the actual situation ourselves, at the actual characters of the feud. I'm going to mention 4 tonight. They're all, to me, quite exciting, horrific things, but they did happen in Carrick, remember that. The first one I want to deal with is the roasting of the commendator. You'll all know Crossraguel Abbey. Well, at the Reformation, the abbeys were done away with. Now, the laird I had mentioned, or rather the Earl of Castles, Gilbert, the 4th Earl, his uncle had been the last abbot. And when the Reformation came about and the lands of the abbey, which were rich lands, came up for sale or for use, he expected to inherit them. As I said, he was a young, greedy man, and it was money he wanted. Unfortunately for him, the Privy Council in Edinburgh awarded Crossraguel to a man called Alan Stewart, who was a scholar of national repute and became commendator of Crossraguel Abbey. Now, Gilbert Kennedy was not happy about this at all, and he decided that there was no way he was going to allow this commendator to take over what he rightfully thought were his lands. Now, there are different stories here. We go back to the Bargany Kennedys now. There is reason to believe that the commendator, this Alan Stewart, was related to Kennedy of Bargany. Some people say he was, and some historians say he wasn't, and we don't absolutely know for certain. But he had an affiliation with Bargany rather than Cassills. So eventually, there are another 2 stories here. One is that Gilbert Kennedy summoned the commendator to discuss the lands of the abbey with him. The other one is that, in fact, he didn't wait that long. The commendator arrived to claim his land at Crossraguel, and one dark night was accosted by Gilbert Kennedy and some armed men in the orchard. He had held a discussion with him and said he wanted to have the land, and there was a big argument followed out. And eventually Kennedy invited him to the Muir Castle, he said, to discuss matters further. "Will you come for your dinner?" he was supposed to have said. And the commendator said, "I've already had my dinner, we don't want to go." To which Kennedy replied, "Well, you're coming on the horse or over it." So they threw him over the horse, but whether he went voluntarily originally through the Muir Castle or he was carried there, which is more likely, he arrived at the Muir, and there Gilbert Kennedy, the 4th Earl of Cassills, had a great ally, a man called Sir William Todd, a serious fighter, a good soldier, but a very cruel and hard man. At the same time with him was the Master of Castle, Gilbert's brother, younger brother. And they tried to talk the commendator into either handing over the lands, or in fact, to be fair to Gilbert, he offered them money for the lands of Crossraguel. But no matter what he offered him, the commendator was not going to be accommodating and would not offer the lands back either for money or as a gift. So Gilbert Kennedy lost his temper and had William Todd and the rest of some of his side men take him down into what was known as the Black Vault of the Ewer, where they stripped him naked and tied him over a frame and roasted him in front of the fire. Now, he was basted while this was going on with oil from his own body. It must have been absolutely horrific. But eventually, every man has got his, he can only suffer so much. And eventually was brought back up into the Great Hall. And Gilbert Kennedy is supposed to have told Todd, take him down, you've ways of finding it out and making him talk. He said, but whatever you do, don't kill him, he has to sign the papers. Well, they brought him up eventually, and eventually because of what they put him through, the commendator, Alan Stewart, agreed to sign over the Abbey lands to the Earl of Cassillis. Well, meanwhile, one way or another, Thomas Kennedy, the Laird of Bargany, found out about this and he was horrified. He was probably a much nicer person than Earl Gilbert. But anyway, he was with his a kinsman called David Kennedy of Maxwellton. And he, with several others, by hook or by crook, went to Dunure and actually recovered the commendator. They helped him to escape. One way or another, he escaped out. And they took him back to Ayr, and eventually he got back to Edinburgh. It was in a dreadful state. And of course, as was right, he made a complaint to the Crown. But this is where you see how powerful the Kennedys were. They had so many friends at court and so much money and everything else. They really got away with things they shouldn't have. And all that happened to Cassillis was that he was fined £2,000 Scots, but allowed to keep the Crossraguel lands. So that's the first bloody deed of the feud. Now, that was about mid-16th century, mid to late 16th century, that happened in the 1500s. The next one I want to mention is known as the tragedy of the Brockloch Burn. Now, it's on the B7024. Those of you who know Carrick will know that there is mid, east and west Brockloch farms, and there's a burn runs down the hill there and right round the area, not where it would be in these days, but it's known as the Brockloch Burn. Now, Gilbert Kennedy, this is the year 1601. It was in the winter when there was a heavy, heavy snowfall and the whole of Carrick was white. Thomas Kennedy of Bargany, Gilbert Kennedy of Bargany rather, was in Ayr doing some business, etc., with some of his supporters, and he had decided to ride all the way back to Bargany that night. Well, this is where the person I talked about earlier, John Muir of Auchendrane, who was one of his staunchest supporters, he tried to talk him out of it. He said, look, he said, you've got to understand that we know that your cousin John Kennedy, who is now the 5th Earl of Cassillis, is determined to put an end to your life. And his uncle, the tutor of Cassillis, Kennedy of Culzean, is egging him on, and the spies, I have found out from my spies that their spies know that you're going to leave and they're going to waylay you on the road back to Bargany. Well, whatever else he was, Gilbert Kennedy of Bargany was one of the finest soldiers of his time, a very handsome, apparently good-looking young man and a very capable soldier. And he said, look, I'm going about my lawful business. He said, the king will not even allow anybody to stop me. I'm not going to have this. I'm going to Bargany, and if my cousin dares to attack me or to do something, I'll defend myself. Well, despite that, all his henchmen decided to try and talk him out of it. He wouldn't be, and they left Ayr with approximately 12 mounted lairs and 120 foot soldiers. Apparently, John Muir of Auchendrane had talked the Ayr burgher people into lending about 40 hackbuttmen, 30 or 40 hackbuttmen, which the hackbutt, if you don't know what it is, it's a type of a very early musket, very inaccurate. And you have to remember that these men were burghers. They were not trained. They were not like fighting men like most of the Kennedys were. However, they left here and they headed back towards Maybole. But meanwhile, in the castle at Maybole, our old friend, the man, the Machiavellian character, Kennedy, the tutor of Cassillis, he was determined to get his young protege, John Kennedy, the new Earl, to waylay his cousin and kill him. He said, it's the only way we'll put an end to this feud. He's got to be killed. Well, initially, I have to say that from my reading of it and the stories I've heard and the reading I've done, John Kennedy, the Earl of Castle, was not in favour of this. He said, this will cause, we'll not get away with it. Even the king, he'll eventually do something if he kills somebody of Bargany's standing. But one thing led to another, and Thomas Kennedy of Culzean eventually talked his protege into going ahead with attacking Kennedy of Bargany on the way home. Well, they left Maybole Castle with quite a heavy armed allegiance, and they arrived on the hill at the top of the Brockloch Burn. We're not just exactly sure where the battle took place, but it was in the middle of a snowstorm. The Bargany Kennedies, with their adherents, came marching up the hill towards the thing and realised they were going to be ambushed at the top. And the battle started with a few hackbutt shots, with not too much damage, we'll have to say, to anybody. But eventually, young Kennedy from Bargany had had enough. He drew his sword and ordered his men to charge his cousin's men at the top of the hill. They rode right up the hill into them, and a massive fight began at the top of the hill. Now, during that, Kennedy of Greenan, who was one of the castle supporters, young Bargany killed him with a cut to his neck, nearly cut his head off with a sword, apparently, and he fell from his horse. On his side, on the other side, on Bargany's side, Muir of Auchendrane he killed, I think, 2 or 3 Kennedy retainers, and then he was stabbed in the thigh and fell from his horse. Another sad person was a guy called Robert Crawford, who was in fact Bargany's steward, and he was killed as well. And Gilbert Kennedy of Bargany killed a few more, but suddenly, in the middle of the melee, as happened in these days, with everybody fighting one another, someone appeared behind Kennedy of Bargany, and it was a man called John Dick who had a lance. And the sad thing is that he had been a former retainer of Bargany's and turned traitor and joined the Earl of Castle's. And he rode up behind young Bargany and stabbed him in the neck from the back, right through the gorget with a lance, and he fell from his horse. Eventually, the fight finished. The Earl of Castle had realised that Bargany was down, thought the work was done, and the fight broke off. Well, the dying were picked up and the wounded were taken back to Ayr, especially Gilbert Kennedy of Bargany. And about 2 or 3 days later, the accounts differ, he died in Ayr from his wounds. Well, the times were so dreadful. He was taken eventually, his body was taken back to Bargany and eventually laid to rest in Ballantrae, in the Kennedy vault, in the graveyard at Ballantrae, and he lies there today, some say, in his full armour. His lady eventually joined him there, and apparently on the day of the funeral, there were between 2,000 and 3,000 mounted lairds and knights from all over Scotland attended the funeral. The strange thing is that Kennedy of Culzean, who organised the whole fight and the ambush, was right. The king didn't bother. Nobody seems to do anything about it. It just appears to have been a fight between the Kennedys, end of story, although it became known as the tragedy of the Brockloch Burn, because, as I say, young Kennedy of Bargany was a fine young man and greatly respected by everybody. Now, the next item of the feud involves the famous John Muir of Auchendrane again, the Grey Man. His wound eventually healed, but he was lame apparently for the rest of his life. And he was determined to gain revenge for the loss of his friend, young Kennedy of Bargany, as was in fact Kennedy's brother, who now became the new Laird of Bargany, Thomas Kennedy, known as the Wolf of Dromorche. Well, Muir plotted for a long time, and eventually he gathered them all in Auchendrane House, or castle as it was then, on the banks of the Doon, and they discussed the matter, and he produced a plan. Now, the internecine rivalry and things of the Kennedys is a strange thing, because Thomas Kennedy, of the tutor of castles at Culzean, was a very clever man. And strangely enough, his daughter was married to John Muir of Auchendrane's son. So it shows you how families were split. And he seemed to have quite kind intentions to people, because he sent a young man called John Dalrymple, a young messenger from Culzean to Auchendrane, to say that I'm leaving Greenan Castle on such and such a morning to go up to Edinburgh because I have business to attend to. Can I be doing any business for you while I'm there? So this was obviously Muir's chance to get revenge. So he called a meeting, as I said, in his castle, and he called in Walter Muir of Cloncaird, Thomas Kennedy of Bargany, the new laird, the Wolf of Drummurchie, a guy called Thomas MacAlexander, who was a staunch Bargany supporter, another Bargany supporter, Thomas Wallace, and a borderer called William Irvine. And the plot was that they would waylay Kennedy of Culzean on his route to Edinburgh and murder him. Now, initially, I have to say that all the reading and all the feedback I've had is that, to be fair, the Wolf of Drummurchie, young Thomas Kennedy, who had now taken on the role of the leader of Bargany, he was not in favour of this. He thought, well, then, this is pure murder. It's not even a fight, it's murder. We'll get into so much trouble over this. But Muir of Auchendrane was a very, very convincing man. And eventually, he convinced them all that this deed would have to be done. So they knew exactly when Culzean would leave Greenan Castle, and he headed towards Ayr, and he went through what was known then as the Wood of St Leonard's. Now, if you all know St Leonard's Church in Ayr, the church is in that area. The Wood of St Leonard's covered that area of the town. And as they went through the Woods of St Leonard's, these people were waiting for him. Thomas Kennedy of Bargany, Walter Muir of Cloncaird, Thomas MacAlexander, Thomas Wallace, and the borderer called William Irvine. They lay in the bushes within the woods for quite a while till they heard the hoofbeats coming through, and along came Kennedy of Culzean with a young squire, Lancelot Kennedy, who was squire to him. And the old man was in the lead with the squire behind him when they all attacked him. And the first thing that happened was, apparently, Thomas Kennedy of Bargany cut him across the neck with his sword. Somebody else shot him in the chest with a dagger, a pistol as it was known. He received another thrust through the middle from one of the other ones with a sword. Nobody's sure exactly which one. And finally, we believe, or I've read to believe, that it was this William Irvine. As the old man lay dying on the ground, he stuck a spear right through his back, through the spine, to finish him off. And then he told the rest to fly for their lives, and he would finish the old man off, much sicker, as they said in Scotland, with a dagger. As for the young squire, of course, he had immediately turned his horse round and headed back to Greenan. And of course, the murderers were petrified that Kennedy of Greenan and some of the other Kennedys would mount an attack and chase them, which didn't actually happen. But they had to fly the country, and 2 or 3 of them had to fly to safety in France for some time because there was a public outcry, and they were put to the horn, as it was said, by the king. Although, again, nothing happened to any of them. And that was the sad end of Thomas Kennedy of Culzean, the tutor of castles. So he got his comeuppance in his own way because he wasn't any better than any of the rest of them. As, of course, did John Muir of Auchendrane. And I'm going to waylay here just a wee bit to fill you in as to what his end was. You'll remember that I said that Culzean had sent a young messenger, John Dalrymple, with the information that he was going to travel to Edinburgh. Now, John Muir was a very savvy person, and he realised that the only way that the murderers could know when he was coming and where he was going was through the information young Dalrymple had passed. And he thought if Dalrymple gets caught and questioned, he's going to tell them, and I'll be in trouble too. So what he did was he actually arranged later on to have young Dalrymple seized and sent to the Isle of Arran, where he was kept semi-prisoner for a while, but he escaped and he came back to Ayr, and he was found at one time later by Muirley supporters and sent again, this time to Belgium, to the wars in France, where nobody really came back because they were quite vicious times. But unfortunately for young Dalrymple, he came back, and Muir and his colleagues caught him at Girvanmain's farm, and they shot him and killed him and buried him in the sand. The body was washed up later. It's a great story. I'm just going to be very brief with it. The body was washed up later, and eventually Muir was caught, and he and his son were actually taken to Edinburgh, tried and executed for the murder of young Dalrymple. So both the Machiavellian characters in this part of the feud both got their comeuppance, so to speak. So the Kennedies of Bargany had further revenge on the castle's faction later on, and this is another story which is very important, but we're not going to tell it tonight, it would take too long, because apparently the Countess of Castles and the Earl's brother, the Master, and some of their men were travelling, I believe, to Dumfries, and they headed through, and they got chased by the Bargany faction, got word of them, chased them, and they were trapped in Auchensul Farm at Bar. The Bargany Kennedys burned the building, and captured the Countess and the young Master of Castles and took them prisoners to Bargany. That's another tale, but that's one for another night. Now, the final actual bloody tale of the Kennedies that I want to tell tonight is the next one, is known as the death of the Master of Stair. Now, I'm going to show you a wee book here. I don't know if you can see it. I wrote this book a good number of years ago, The Blood Feud of the Kennedies, and all these stories are in it. There it's there. It's out of print now, but it has a foreword from the Marquis of Ayrshire, Lord Charles Kennedy, 8th Marquis of Ayrshire and 19th Earl of Castles. And we put this booklet together. A lot of it went to America, where they are very, very interested in the Kennedy faction. Anyway, the death of the Master of Stair is one of the final stories in that. Now, you're going to probably think the Master of Stair, that's down at Stranraer. Well, remember what I said, the Kennedies had a lot of control down into Fleece and Galloway. And for some reason, it's not all 100% clear. The Dalrymples of Stair were great supporters of the Bargany Kennedies. And in fact, Thomas Dalrymple, the young Master of Stair, had actually taken part in the battle at the Brockloch Burn on Bargany's side. And he had also apparently been involved in the burning of Auchenshrew Farm and the taking of the prisoners to Bargany, as I mentioned earlier. So what happened then? Well, he was going to Bargany because he had heard, well, he knew that the Countess had been captured, and not only the Countess, but the Master of Stair was kept prisoner at Bargany, and he knew that the new Laird of Bargany, the Wolf of Demurchy, young Bargany's brother, who was now the Laird, was a different person altogether from his brother, and would very possibly maybe be capable of murdering the Countess of Castle and the Master. And Dalrymple knew that this would cause all sorts of havoc. So he was heading to Bargany to speak with Bargany and try and talk him into returning the Countess, etc. Well, he stayed on his way from Stranraer. He stayed overnight in Ardstinchar Castle at Ballantrae. Now, Ardstinchar Castle is a fascinating place. It was held by the Bargany side of the Kennedy family, and Thomas Dalrymple stayed there overnight before he headed for Bargany. Now, he had with him at that time what was known as a sergeant at arms, or a squire, called Walter MacCulloch. And Walter MacCulloch, they had 2 horses with them. The Master of Stair had a black charger, which was a bit spent. It was an old horse, but he loved the horse and he wouldn't ride the other one. He had a new one, this grey, which was much faster. But that was being ridden by Walter MacCulloch. So they're going to leave Ardstinchar Castle. They were going to leave Ardstinchar Castle and head for Bargany. And MacCulloch apparently had pleaded with the Master of Stair. He said, let's go by the coast. He says it's safer. If we go up to the Stinchar Valley, he said, Craigneil is now occupied by the Earl of Castles. And he says, sure as good as we could end up in trouble. But of course, the Master of Stair, nobody interferes with me. I'm the Master of Stair. I'll do what I want. It's quicker to go by Stinchar Valley, and that's what they did. Well, they're riding up the Stinchar Valley on apparently quite a good day, and talking and quite happy, etc. And they were passing near Craigneil Castle, when suddenly out of the woods round about them appeared, we reckon, between 30 and 40 Castle's horsemen, heavily armoured. And would you believe who led them? John Dick, the man who had killed young Bargany at the Brockloch Burn and had turned traitor. He had originally been a Bargany man, but he was now firmly in place with the Earl of Castles. Well, when they saw young Stair, they knew who he was, and they decided they would have him because they knew he had been involved in the feuds, etc. And they chased him and his young squire, his master at arms, him and MacCulloch, right along the Stinchar Valley. And of course, inevitably, the Master of Stair's horse, the old Blackwind, began to get exhausted, very tired, began to falter. And the Castle's faction began to catch up on them, with John Dick leading them in the front. Well, young MacCulloch pleaded with the Master of Stair. He says, look, switch horses. You take the grey. It's faster. You have a chance of getting away. I'll take the black and take my chances. However, the Master of Stair, being a very honourable man, said, under no circumstances, I'm keeping my black horse. You get in the grey, ride to Bargany, tell them what's happened, get in touch with my father, the Earl of Stair, or Lord Stair, or whoever he was at that time, and they'll come to my rescue. So that's what happened. Young MacCulloch, very sportingly, or rather didn't want to go, but he rode away and left the Master of Stair riding ahead of the Bargany faction, the Castles faction. Well, John Dick led his men and they caught up, and eventually the Master of Stair drew a pistol from his holster, turned round just as John Dick caught up with him and shot John Dick right through the forehead. And he fell to the ground dead as a dodo, as we would say, and the other horseman had to ride over the top of him. So that was the end of John Dick. Another rather wicked man, not a nice person, who got his comeuppance in the Kennedy feud. But unfortunately, Stair's horse faltered and he fell to the ground. The horse fell and he went with it. And before he knew where he was surrounded by a whole lot of the castle's men, soldiers who dismounted. And one of them, according to one of the stories, is he had pulled the dirt and was going to cut the Master of Stair's throat, when who should appear himself but John Kennedy, the 5th Earl of Cassillis. Now, whatever else he might be, he wasn't just going to have this man killed out. He wanted revenge. He knew how much Stair had supported the Kennedies of Bargany, so he took him to Craigniel Castle and questioned him. And he said to him, look, he said, I've had enough of this. He said, you're going to pay the penalty for all of this. He said, if you do not drop your fealty to Bargany and swear fealty to me, he said, then I'm going to try you. Now, it wasn't a fair trial. He tried him in the Great Hall at Craigniel, and of course it was a one-sided affair. He found him guilty and sentenced to be hanged from the yett of Craigniel, the entrance to the castle. And he said to him, now, if you swear fealty and abjure your sins, I might still save you. To which, to be for his credit, Stair said, no, I'm a Bargany man, you're an evil man. He said, I've got no time for you. He said, as far as I'm concerned, he says, you'll end up no better than me. And he wouldn't be convinced, and he took the oath to Bargany instead of Castles, and he was hanged from the yett of Craigniel Castle. And you can go down to Cincher Valley today and see the ruin of Craigniel Castle. So that was the end of him, and that was the end of some of the bloody business of the feud. But there are many, many other stories. You would not believe the number there are. You could write half a dozen books, and hopefully I'm going to try and follow them all up eventually. But we'll have to limit ourselves tonight to what we can tell you, and it can be too much information. So let's, for a moment now, before we sort of wind down, look at the Kennedies today. What is the situation today? Because they were a very famous family. They owned at one time almost every great house and building in Carrick. I mean, some of the properties are there today and others are not. In fact, if you look carefully at it, I'm just trying to look here. You had Bargany, you had Craigniel, you had Castles, you had Dunure, you had Greenan Castle, nearly, and you had all over Carrick. There. And when we look at property, somebody was a laird of a property. It wasn't always a castle. If you look at some of the farms in Carrick, the older farms, they were built in a square for defence. The main house would be inside and be a curtain wall around the whole lot. So many of these houses that were there belonged to Kennedies. I think I mentioned some of them. The Lairdships, for instance, again, we've got Castle of Culzean, Craigniel, Dunure, Cincher at Ballantrae, Bargany, Knockdaw, and Bennin are just a few of them. I want to go back to Cincher for a minute or two because it's a well-known castle. And a book called The Grey Man about John Muir was written, and it's a very old book, and it's a great story about the Kennedies. But there's two mistakes in it, and it was written by the man who wrote it. He said in the beginning that Cincher Castle was burned to the ground by the Earl of Castles. It wasn't. It fell into disuse. And the second myth is the tale of Sonny Bean the cannibal. Sonny Bean never really existed, but people still think he did. So these are two myths in The Grey Man. So let's now move to the Kennedies today. Through my interest in Carrick and Kennedy family history, I was very fortunate to meet, work with, and become a very close friend of the late Lord Charles Kennedy, Marquess of Ailsa and 19th Earl of Castles. In addition, in my day-to-day work when I was an environmental health officer in Carrick, and my involvement with Carrick 800 Battle Reenactment Society, it led me to meet his brother, Lord David, who is now the 19th Marquess of Ailsa and 20th Earl of Castles. And again, in turn with his son, Lord Archie Kennedy, who is greatly interested and very knowledgeable about his incredible family history. The late Lord Charles was a staunch supporter of the Kennedy Society of North America, which in fact has its own sub-chief and many members who support every clan gathering in the United States every year. Lord Charles used to organise Kennedy tours of Scotland and Ireland, and I was honoured to assist him in these tours, both as a guide and as his historian. As a result, I'm still in touch with the Society and indeed an honorary member of that society, and I've been able to help many of the members with family research on which the Americans, as you'll know, are very, very keen. They produced an excellent quarterly clan magazine to which I contribute, and Lord David provides a family update in every issue. To me, it's incredible and exciting that the Kennedy family have retained their long and inventive history, I think I'm trying to say, and are still strongly represented and held in very high esteem, both at home and abroad. Currently, Lord David has developed Cassillis and Culzean estate with environmental management standards set so high as to have achieved national recognition. Now, one other thing I think I would like to mention to you, they're a great family, but we must remember, I've had this discussion with a lot of different people over the years about the clan system in Scotland. And the Kennedys, Lord Charles and I used to discuss this regularly because he was a great believer in the Clan Kennedy, and they call it the Clan Kennedy Society in America. And I used to keep saying to him, you are not a clan, you are a family, a lone family. And he would say to me, but we've got a tartan. And I said, yes, you have a tartan. You know why you've got a tartan? I said, because in the Victorian times, when Sir Walter Scott started his Carry On, he decided everybody in Scotland should have a tartan, not just the Highland families. In the Highlands, a clan is the family. And the difference between them and the Kennedys, as I said to Lord Charles and to Lord David, a wonderful family, a fantastic collection, but they were never over the Highland line in their life. They are a very, very important lone family. But every family in Scotland now has got a tartan, so good luck to them. Well, tonight, we've only really glanced at some of the history of the Kennedys. There are still dozens and dozens of fascinating facts and stories still to be told. All I can say now is that I hope you've enjoyed our chat and maybe even been encouraged to follow up your own history and tales of the Kingdom of Carrick. We live in one of the most exciting parts of Scotland with a fantastic history. It broke away from Galloway in 1186 under the MacDowell family and has never stopped being important since. And to this day, as you come into Carrick, you'll still see a sign saying, "Welcome to Carrick." Thank you all very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if the ladies